Good morning and greetings from UNCTAD in Geneva. I would like to start by thanking the West Africa Quality System with the support for the implementation of the quality policy of ECOWAS, of UNIDO, and supported by the European Union for giving UNCTAD the opportunity of being here with you today. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to join you in person today due to social movements in Europe that have cancelled my flight. I nevertheless expect to be with you tomorrow and to work closely to draft a consumer protection action plan. In this first presentation, I would like to address the new international framework for consumer protection, namely the Guidelines for Consumer Protection. In so doing, I will conduct my presentation in English, but I will keep the slides in French. Thank you. The content of my presentation is the following. I will first briefly present what UNCTAD does. We will then look at what consumer protection is and what are the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection. We will then briefly take a glimpse of what national policies for consumer protection are, and finally, we will read some conclusions. Let me first start by giving you some insight on what UNCTAD is. UNCTAD is the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. It was established in 1964, and all members of the General Assembly are currently members of UNCTAD. UNCTAD has about 200 civil servants, all based in Geneva. UNCTAD is the focal point within the United Nations for trade and development issues, and it is also the focal point for competition and consumer protection issues within the United Nations family. Let us now look at what makes consumer protection. Consumer protection are policies that include laws, regulations, rules, frameworks, procedures, decisions, mechanisms, and programs of member states, as well as private sector standards and recommendations that protect consumers' rights and interests and promote consumer welfare. This is the definition that is contained in the UN guidelines. But let's see, what are the objectives of consumer protection? Well, first of all, consumer protection seeks to facilitate the production and the distribution patterns that are responsive to the needs and desires of consumers. And perhaps this is the primary right and objective of consumer protection. It also tries to encourage high levels of ethical conduct of those engaged in the production and distribution of goods and services to consumers. It aims to assist countries in curbing abusive business practices by all enterprises at the national as well as international level, which effectively adversely affect consumers. It tries to facilitate the development of independent consumer groups, and it encourages the development of market conditions which provide consumers with greater choice at lower prices. Consumer protection ultimately tries to promote sustainable consumption and sustainable and inclusive development. Let's see what is the rationale behind consumer protection. Modern consumer protection policy was first framed by John F. Kennedy, President of the United States of America, address to Congress on 15th of March 1962. In its address, President Kennedy said that consumers by definition include us all. They are the largest economic group in the economy, affecting and affected by almost every public and private economic decision. 2/3 of all spending in the economy is by consumers. But they are only important group in the economy who are not effectively organized, whose views are not often heard. fortunate as we are, we nevertheless cannot afford waste in consumption any more than we can afford inefficiency in business or government. If consumers are offered inferior products, if prices are exorbitant, if drugs are unsafe or worthless, if the consumer is unable to choose on an informed basis, then his dollar is wasted, his health and safety may be threatened, and the national interest suffers. On the other hand, increased efforts to make the best possible use of their income can contribute more to the well-being of most families than equivalent efforts to raise their incomes. We thus see three types of justification for consumer protection: legal, economic, and development-wise. From a legal point of view, businesses as well as consumers have rights in the marketplace, and they need to be enforced and enforceable. From an economic point of view, consumer protection helps redistribute overall welfare to most productive and those who deserve it more. It increases efficiencies and improves competitiveness of business. Finally, from a development perspective, consumer protection aims to reduce inequalities within and among countries and raise people's standard of living from previous ones. In this sense, sustainable development is clearly linked to individual empowerment, and this is also the case for the Sustainable Development Goals which guide us all in our development efforts, namely the right to promote an economic social development that is fair, equitable, and sustainable, which goes hand in hand with consumer protection proper. It is common to hear that consumer protection can be an impediment for the development of businesses, but is it true? Well, in fact, businesses that comply with consumer protection and then seek consumer experience, they are increased their competitiveness vis-a-vis other market players, both nationally and internationally, and trade facilitation measures such as consumer protection help increase consumer trust in both national and international markets and thus enhance trade among nations. It is never too soon to integrate consumer protection in market regulations and development policies. Let us see what the rationale is for consumer protection. Indeed, in an ideal market, consumers and businesses have the same market power or the same bargaining power. That is, the balance would be still. However, there is an inherent imbalance in market conditions. Businesses know more and better their rights, they know more and better how to enforce them, and they control most of the consumer experience. On the other hand, consumers are essentially vulnerable in a contractual relation with businesses or with the market as a whole. It is thus necessary to have government policies and laws to balance that situation and empower the consumer in the marketplace. This is why consumer protection policies are put in place precisely to balance that situation and empower the consumer. And this takes us to the UN guidelines for consumer protection. The UN guidelines for consumer protection come from 1985, but its latest revision of 70/186 of 22 December 2015. In its resolution on consumer protection, the General Assembly reaffirmed that the guidelines are a valuable set of principles for setting out the main characteristics of effective consumer protection legislation, enforcement institutions, and redress systems for assisting interested member states in formulating and enforcing domestic and regional laws, rules, and regulations that are suitable to their own economic and social and environmental circumstances, as well as promoting international enforcement cooperation among member states and encouraging the sharing of experiences in consumer protection. This is indeed the international legal framework for consumer protection. Interestingly, the guidelines are a set of recommendations for member states. They are in no case compulsory upon them, and they do not contain inherent obligations. However, UNCTAD's report on the implementation of the UN Guidelines for Consumer Protection from 1985 to 2013, which is the document TB/B/CI/CLP/23, concluded that since 1985, the UN Guidelines on consumer protection have been widely implemented by member states of the United Nations. National contributions to this revision process show that all areas of the current guidelines remain valid and useful, and whereas the guidelines cover a wide range of issues, some new challenges to consumer protection have been identified, such as e-commerce, financial services, and data protection, abusive advertisement, cross-border trade, which will merit further consultations. Indeed, all these issues led to the revision of the UN guidelines in 2015. And nowadays we have a very modern set of recommendations encompassing most parts of consumer protection, not to say all, and providing insightful recommendations for members. This will be the basis of our workshop in the coming 2 days. The characteristics of the guidelines are four. The first is continuity and novelty. The guidelines were first adopted in 1985. It were expanded in 1999 to include sustainable consumption, and when they were thoroughly revised in 2015. The second one is cross-cutting nature. The UN guidelines cover a wide range of issues, including not only the remit of consumer protection proper, but everything that has to do with a consumer protection policy. That is, they include public utilities, energy, food, pharmaceuticals. It is this holistic view that the guidelines encapsulate that help policy recommendations and help governments get the insights of best business practices. The third, and perhaps most important, is that the guidelines are flexible. That is, each member state, as it is clearly set in the guidelines, must set its own priorities for the protection of consumers in accordance with the economic, social, and environmental circumstances of the country and the needs of its population, and bearing in mind the costs and benefits of proposed measures. Finally, the guidelines encapsulate a new concept, which is that of co-responsibility. That is, the primary responsibility for ensuring laws and consumer protection policies are of member states, that is, parliament, governments, and judges. But it is also the responsibility of businesses and consumer groups to uphold those policies and to enhance consumer culture in the marketplace. Let us now look at what is the content of the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection, of which I will bring some copies when I get to you. Its structure is very easy, and it only has 7 chapters, with 99 guidelines all in all. The first is about the objectives, the second one is of the scope, third is general principles, and fourth is principles for good business practices. The fifth and largest chapter is that of guidelines themselves, to later finish with international cooperation and international institutional machinery at UNCTAD. The content of its most substantive part is that of the guidelines Title 5. It then contains the national policies for consumer protection, which we will see in a very short while, recommendations for physical safety for the promotion and protection of economic interest of consumers, the standards of safety and quality of consumers' goods and services, the distribution facilities for essential consumer goods and services, dispute resolution and redress, education and information programs, the promotion of sustainable consumption, electronic commerce, financial services, and measures relating to specific areas. Now that we've seen what the guidelines look like, or what its general context, I would like to put the focus on some things that I think are of particular interest to this program, to WASP, but also to developing countries, especially West African countries. One of them is Section D on the standards for the safety and quality of consumer goods and services. UNCTAD data shows that African countries' product safety standards are lower than elsewhere in the world, and this is a situation that worries policymakers in Africa and beyond. Now, the guidelines from 33 to 35 address this issue and provide some key recommendations and best practices that can be useful when developing national policies. It sets that standards, voluntary and other, at the national and international level for the safety and quality of goods and services need to be given the appropriate publicity. That is, an awareness-raising necessity that all developing countries and developers alike need to carry out. Guideline 34 sets that where a standard lower than the generally accepted internationally standard is being applied because of local economic conditions, every effort should be made to raise the standards as soon as possible. And I think this is a good guideline to show the important role of WASP and its contribution to the consumer protection frameworks in West African countries. And finally, this section asks to ensure the availability of facilities to test and certify the safety, quality, and performance of essential consumer goods and services. Let me now turn very briefly to another important guideline, that is 36, on the provision of essential goods and services. Well, this is key for most developing countries and also for West African countries, and that is the member states should adopt policies that try to ensure the distribution of essential goods and services, and to adopt policies that guarantee distribution to rural areas, for example, that they assist the creation of stocking facilities for commercial practices, and they allow the development for consumer groups to develop the structures necessary for the distribution of those essential goods and services, which include food and pharmaceuticals, among others. Now that we look at some of very specific consumer protection issues that are touched upon in the guidelines, let's see what the broader national policies for consumer protection would look like. Well, the guidelines in Guideline 14 establish that the necessary components of a consumer protection policy, that is, at government level state, is to encourage good business practices, is to guarantee that there's information to contact businesses and authorities by consumers, and also businesses by authorities, and that this may include information such as the identity of the business, its legal name, the name under which it trades, its principal geographic address, its website and email, if they have it, or other means of contact. National policies for consumer protection should also guarantee that there is adequate and easily understandable information regarding the goods and services and the terms and conditions that unite consumers and businesses, that there is clear, concise, and easy to understand contract terms that are not unfair, that there is a transparent process for confirmation, cancellation, and return, that there is a secure payment system, fair and affordable and speedy dispute resolution and redress, and that there is enough concern for consumer data privacy and security. And finally, that enough is done to ensure consumer and business education. Let me now move to the conclusions of my presentation. And these are more open questions for you to react upon. First is, what is the interest that you would find in integrating consumer protection in member countries of the West Africa Quality System Program? What use do you think you can give to the United Nations guidelines? How would we develop a consumer protection policy in your country or regionally? And what kind of synergies can we find between states, business, and civil society, which is key for a successful and inclusive consumer protection policy? This is the end of my presentation. I hope to see you very soon. Thank you very much.